Good evening, I'm Yuji Nakamura, and you are watching the extended, uncut interview with the developer of Monospaced Lovers. This interview was a part of the fall 2024 broadcast of The Verdict. Be sure to check out Monospaced Lovers, available now on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5, and PC. Hello to people watching at home across the Sega Channel and YouTube broadcast. I am Yuji Nakamura. I am out here with a man who calls himself Eternal, who has created the game Monospaced Lovers. In fact, this game has actually just come out and is available on Nintendo Switch, PS5, and PC. Why don't you give us an introduction, Eternal?
All right, sounds good. So yeah, I usually describe the game as like a platform adventure game, which if you think about it, sounds a bit like a Metroidvania, but it's a little bit different, the way that the map is laid out. It's a long story. But basically you have kind of like platformer-ish, adventure-ish gameplay, kind of like the puzzles that you'd find in a Zelda or something like that. And then also combined with a storyline that was inspired by, anime and visual novels and all this other stuff that I grew up with.
So if I remember correctly, Monospaced Lovers was actually featured at the first V3 back in 2020. Can you talk about if there were any big challenges from then to now in terms of gameplay or direction?
Things have changed since back then, for sure. The most noticeable difference is that a lot of the art is actually totally different right now. So we had gone through like a few different artists in the process of developing the game, actually. Sometimes people just kind of like overbook their schedules, or people just flake out for one reason or another. But the end result was that the main artist right now, previously, she was only doing the character art. And then after that, she ended up doing like pretty much all the art for the game, including the environments. So that's one thing that will look really different from the current version of the game compared to the 2020 version. And besides that, the gameplay hasn't really changed, to be honest, but like the old versions were really buggy compared to right now. So I had to spend quite a while just like, because I didn't know much about programming at first, so I had to spend a while like re-implementing stuff that I made before so that just the code base wouldn't break every time.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of developers can relate to you on that. On the topic of being relatable, almost every person who has ever created anything has been inspired by something that caused the creation. Tell us a bit more about what inspired Monospaced Lovers.
This story was just inspired by real life more than anything else, to be quite honest. Just from glancing at the store page, you can kind of see that the game is like themed around like a long distance relationship. And so I wanted something that would capture that feeling. And from that starting point, like I guess like the story led to the gameplay in a way, because I wanted to have like these text messages going back and forth that would be kind of in the background of the game. But in order for that to be in the background, something else has to be in the foreground, right? Like a walking sim or something like that. And then, while I was doing that, then I ended up starting to learn Unity, learning how to code properly. And then it led me to like another thing unrelated to that I enjoy is like I grew up with Zelda, of course, many people did. And Fez is actually one of my favorite games of all time. And Fez is very much inspired by the original NES Zelda. So that's kind of what led me into thinking about these puzzles that are more complicated, like the cryptography stuff, like, decoding like an alien language and basically just trying to recapture that sense of adventure that kids feel when we played Zelda when we were like 12, except something that would still make you feel that way when you're older, because that's how I felt when I played Fez when I was like 22 or whatever.
I think a lot of guys watching this would like to know your secret with marketing. It appears you have done plenty for it, including conventions. Did you work with any publishers, or in general, what was your strategy?
Right, so marketing is a big topic for sure. The first thing I would say in terms of tips is there's a blog called How to Market a Game, which you've probably heard of already. And there's also a newsletter called Game Discover Co. So between those two, like that's where I got most of my knowledge. So if you want to go in depth, I would say go read those. As for this game specifically, I think that getting onto Steam events is probably the biggest source of like wish lists. And this can be a little bit tricky because a lot of Steam events are curated. For example, there's one called Ludo Narracon. It's put on by, I think, Serenity Forge or like some publisher or the other. So it's an event about narrative games. But again, like it's you have to apply and kind of hope they accept you. So in this case, like I actually didn't get into that one. So part of the marketing game is just about applying to every event that comes up and hoping that people let you in. But then outside of that as well, I mean, all of these factors are interlinked, right? Like talking to YouTubers and stuff like that, getting more organic interest through social media, like everything is interlinked, and that's why marketing is such a complicated topic. On the topic of publishers, yeah, I do have a publisher for console and for Asia, except this was like a kind of a smaller scale deal, like because they didn't provide the localization or anything. They just provided like marketing support mostly. So yeah, the details of the deal are like a bit different from what you'd associate with the publishing deal. But I would say like it was useful in some ways. It's useful in the context of like consoles in particular. Like let's say you want to get into Nintendo's indie world or something like that. There's no easy way for you to like pitch to Nintendo as a developer. They kind of, I mean, you can kind of send them an email and ask, but that's more of a, basically it's easier for publishers to like talk directly to the indie world staff or to get your game in front of the right people. So that's one area where it can be helpful. I think if you're doing PC only, it would be a bit less helpful. And yeah, the crux of marketing still comes down to like Steam is the best source of traffic, but it's a chicken and egg problem. Like it's a circular problem because how do you get onto the front page of Steam? And then it's like you need Steam to give you wish lists. And then after you get more wish lists, then Steam will give you more placement on the front page, and then it becomes circular. So yeah, that's like a rough overview, but there's a whole lot to say about marketing for sure.
You mentioned there at the end, the publisher helped handle the Asian disruption and localization. What's it like working with multiple languages, especially with a puzzle game? How does translating go into the game design?
So the localization was actually in progress already, like at the time of signing that deal. So the publishing deal was more about like the marketing end and press outreach and stuff like that. And as for actually handling the localization myself, it was interesting. The first thing I would say is that it can be expensive for a story heavy game. The average price that people will quote you is around 5 cents per word. Per word? Yeah, per word. So you can do the math on that. In terms of actually implementing it, it's not too bad. This was a Unity game, by the way, so I'm not doing any complicated engine dev kind of things. Like the Unity can mostly handle it, but you do have to spend some time on font in particular, like finding like a different style for every language, making sure that the UI text will auto adjust its size so that a word that's one line in English won't suddenly become 2 lines in Portuguese or something, and then mess up the entire UI. So you have to spend some time on that. But I think probably more interestingly would be like the creative aspect of it. Because yes, there were some things that we had to kind of approach differently in different languages. And it wasn't so much in terms of story, but actually in terms of the puzzles. Because the game has like some language specific puzzles, basically. So one of the things in the game is that like the creatures, like the non-human characters, they all speak with a substitution cipher. Meaning that like, let's say the letter A corresponds with the letter D or something. Like all the letters are shifted by 4. So in English, that's straightforward enough. But then in Chinese, you can't necessarily shift letters because they don't really have an alphabet, right? They have characters. So the whole thing just like gets really complicated when you start having substitution ciphers in different languages, because like there was one puzzle I was working on recently, or debugging recently, where like the answer to the puzzle requires you to type something in English, like in Latin characters. So if you were to play the game in Russian, for example, even if you were to decode like what the character, what the NPC is saying, like you would know that, oh, this Russian letter corresponds to that Russian letter. Even if you could do that, it wouldn't actually help you to type this password with Latin characters, with like English characters. So I had to like change how the cipher works in that language so that it would be basically so that you could figure it out. So there are like some puzzles that make sense in English, and then it would just be literally impossible to figure out in a non-Latin language. So that's just one example of like one of the more interesting challenges we came across.
Thank you, Eternal, for the interview.